as Teams shoots up to 95% CPU because I pressed one button. Okay, the recording and the transcript have now started. So as ever, you're welcome to come on, ask questions, but be aware you may be recorded, but questions in the chat will not be recorded, so you're safe putting them in there. They won't appear in any public document. Okay, so last week we went through compliance. We talked about that as being in terms of complying with legislative standards. Now, of course, the people that have to do that are staff. And you would hope that staff understand about their duties and what they have to do, but it's not always the case. And even if it is the case, one of the things that we've been talking about in terms of this whole course is the idea that even if we do things, it's important to record them somewhere so that if something goes wrong, we can say, yeah, we're really sorry about that. We did our best. And we can show you that we did our best and we have it all fully recorded, all the things that we did and all the things we tried to do to stop this problem occurring. One of the ways that we can do that, and certainly in terms of our staff and in terms of our need to comply with legislation, is to introduce a code of conduct. And you'll see that in all sorts of different professions. And if you go to the module materials and look at the compliance section, you'll see I've put up a whole set of codes of conduct for different types of profession. So there's a solicitor's code of conduct, there's a banking code, there's codes of conduct for people in public life, and there's even one code of conduct for a private company. And one of the reasons we do these things is to ensure that our staff know what's expected of them. There can't be any dubiety anywhere. If they say, no, we didn't know that this was a thing, we didn't know that we had to do this or not do that. So quite often for an organisation, you will want to set up a code of conduct. And certainly for what you're doing, you want to explain why that might be a good idea, and you might want to give some suggestions as to the types of things that may be in there. Particularly if your case study is for a new organisation, or at the very least for existing organisations that are reconfiguring and incorporating new things. You might want to set those expectations for everybody. So organisations might find it really helpful to have that code of conduct in black and white that all employees can look at and understand what the expectations are on them. Now, it could be something dead simple. It could be, don't accept an all expenses paid trip to the Scotland rugby game with hospitality, or if you do, make sure you tell everybody about it so that nobody can say that you were unduly influenced by the money that was spent on you. That's a kind of standard one for just about every organisation. Don't put yourself into a place where people could even suggest that you weren't working in the best interests of the organisation, that instead you did it because of some gratuity that you got, or because some other organisation showed you some favouritism. And of course, for organisations that have members in places of trust, lawyers, doctors, whatever it happens to be, that becomes very precise in terms of the codes of conduct, because it will include codes of ethics and all sorts of other codes that say how they should approach their um, how they should conduct themselves in their approach to their place in the organisation. Which is why I've covered some of those in the material. And this, of course, isn't new. People have had codes of conduct for millennia. What is thou shalt not kill if it's not a code of conduct? So we have been doing these things for a long, long time. Whether it's one of those 10 commandments that I just come up with, or whether it's the 5 pillars of Islam or the 10 precepts of Taoism, it really doesn't matter. The point is, people have tried to say, this is the standard that we should be living up to. And that has continued throughout history as doctors take on their codes of conduct. They swear a Hippocratic oath to this day about what they can and can't do with a patient. Most of you will have heard the first line of that, first do no harm. And that kind of approach has continued. And as I say, there's links there to solicitors, bankers, that kind of codes of conduct. And it's probably worth looking at one of those just to get an idea of what it is that they are asked to do and what they're specifically asked not to. So here's the standards for solicitors. Now, the full thing is linked there, but these are the main points here. Starting off with honesty and integrity. Now, of course, that you would hope that would go without saying. But of course, part of the reason we embody these types of things in a code of conduct and have that paper trail is to say, no, there can't be any dubiety about this. Of course you have to be honest. Of course you have to have integrity. And as I say, it should be a given, but having it in there just says, no, we are doing this. And it's not just for the people who are following this code of conduct. It's for other people as well, so that they can be shown to be doing that, so that they can say, yes, we do follow a code of conduct, and this is our top of the line. We will be honest with you. We will have integrity when dealing with you. And it goes through, again, so a lot of things that you might expect to be a given, and of course, it probably should be, but it is still worth making them clear to everyone. Keep things confidential. You act in the client's best interest, not your own. Fees will be fair and reasonable. You can only work with a client's permission. All of that kind of stuff is very clear and laid out in terms that are unequivocal. And the sorts of things that you see in there are fairly standard for anyone in any type of organisation. Which organisation wouldn't want their staff to behave honestly and with integrity? What kind of organisation wouldn't want their staff to keep things confidential? What kind of organisation wouldn't want their staff to be thorough and diligent, or communicate clearly and effectively, or treat each other with mutual respect and trust? So even though this is a solicitor's code of conduct, for many things, it's a standard that lots of organisations should be looking for. Not sure what you mean, James. Facebook and Twitter? So what's that in relation to? Communicate clearly and effectively, possibly. So we have this idea that we have a code of conduct. Oh, not keeping things private, yeah. And of course, there was a recent case where a solicitor was admonished for, admonished is a legal word, so don't take that verbatim, but they certainly had an issue with their professional body, because they were discussing a case on a train. That people could overhear. Professional misconduct for discussing a case on a train. And from memory, this advocate was actually the head of the advocate's body at the time. And this was, what, a year ago? That's right. He was a dean of the Faculty of Advocates. So lots of people can be caught out. Even people you'd expect to know better. Which leads me quite neatly on to my first point there. Codes are important, but they're not a panacea. They don't stop people doing silly things. And actually, if you have someone at the top of an organisation, like the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, ignoring parts of the Code of Conduct, it doesn't bode well for everyone else in that organisation. Just because you have a Code of Conduct, if that Code of Conduct is not taken seriously, then you will have an issue. And we talked about Arthur Anderson a few weeks ago, the accountants who were supposedly checking an organisation's accounts to make sure that they were fair, but at the same time, they were working for them on a consultancy basis. So their approach to ensuring the correct accounts were recorded was less scrupulous than it may have been, in part because they were concerned about losing these lucrative consultancy fees. And that's part of the reason that Arthur Anderson no longer exists. So it's not just about writing it down. It's about living up to it. It's about the person at the top setting standards. Dare I say, it's about the person at the top not setting laws that they then break themselves, because that then says to everyone else, why are we bothering? So codes of conduct have to have alongside them a sense of ethics, a clear sense of an ethical approach to an organisation and to professional conduct. And of course, if you don't have that, it doesn't matter how many times you write down a code of conduct. It won't make any difference if people simply ignore it. So leaders have to provide that example to the rest of the staff. But this isn't a one and done type thing. This isn't write the code of conduct, we are finished. You have to ensure that people understand it. You have to enforce it. You have to check that it's been enforced. So you decide what your code of conduct is. You decide how you're going to approach that. You set a course. Sounds like governance to me. You try and figure out where the code of conduct may or may not be helpful, where it may or may not be followed, and where you might have to look in order to check that it's not being breached. Sounds like risk. And then you check whether that's been done, and you take the appropriate action if required. So code of conduct is governance, risk, and compliance in microcosm. So as I say, there are plenty of these codes that I've given you links to. I gave you the solicitor's code of conduct there and just gave you the kind of bullet points. And part of the reason I didn't give you the whole thing, although the link's there, is it's 34 pages. But it's certainly worth having a look through, and it's definitely worth looking at the headings for each of the sections and trying to understand what it is that they are trying to cover. Because the ones in there and the ones that I've put up on the slide there are kind of common ones. How you act both with your colleagues and with your clients. And again, I don't want to go back to it, but it's just so easy to show an example. The next one is bullying. There was a case last year where the Home Secretary was found to have bullied her staff. And it was recommended that action should be taken. Action was not taken. In other words, the bullying was condoned. The setting of that type of standard simply says, no, we can do anything. There are no standards anymore. And that, I would suggest, is not a good way for any organisation, let alone a country, to be run. There are sections on gifts. What can you accept? And again, they just make it so easy. Open up a newspaper and you'll find a whole bunch of MPs who accept gifts, hospitality, consultancy fees from all sorts of organisations for whom they then advocate. Now, just to make it clear, there is a process for this, and you can declare these earnings. And then it's up to us to decide whether or not people have allowed that to influence their beliefs and what they're advocating for and how they vote. But there are other people who don't declare these things. And you can see that with a lot of the PPE procurement that happened over the last few years. So there are multiple approaches, but the ones in the Scottish Solicitor's Code of Conduct are reasonable, as are some of the other codes of conduct. So that's Scottish Solicitors. It won't let me come out of full screen mode. Come on. You can do it. While that's working its way through, Caroline has made the point that her employer used the Nolan principles. If you haven't come across them, and actually I don't know why I haven't put them into the module materials, the Nolan principles are a set of principles for those in public life. And we will look at them in a wee second, because they are incredibly important. And as with the solicitors one there, do actually provide a decent set of standards for all sorts of areas. So the other codes that I do have here include the banking code. And here's where I have an issue with the banking code. The banking code does not have sanctions because the banking code is voluntary. Given everything that we now know about banks and their approach to business, are you comfortable that the banking code is voluntary? Or would you prefer it was backed up by legislation? And I'll leave that as a question for you. Those in public life have a code of conduct. So here in Scotland, if you're elected as a councillor, you have a code of conduct. And here, the code of conduct is not voluntary. Not only is it not voluntary, you're forced to follow it by law. So anyone breaching the code of conduct here can be charged. It includes a code of conduct. It introduces an ethical framework. And it is very, 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 very long. "34 pages for a code of conduct for those that it covers a whole pile of things that we are probably becoming used to now. So if we just look at those headings, relationships with colleagues and members of the public, bullying, conduct, gifts and hospitality, confidentiality. So we're seeing the same things appear again and again. There's this idea that there's a registration of interests. In other words, if you own a company, even if you own a house, that's stored somewhere so that you can see whether or not a decision was taken, in your opinion, because it was a good decision to take or because it benefited you personally. So you have to declare all those interests. Interestingly, MPs also have a code of conduct, but it's less strict than the one for Scottish local government councillors. And again, I'll leave it up to you to decide why that is and whether or not you're happy with that. Now, again, these are easy to come across. So again, the public ones are easy to come across. What's less easy to come across are ones for private companies. But I have managed to find one for GSK, who are a chemical/pharmaceutical company. And part of the reason they have done this is to prove to their customers that they are an ethical company, that they have a code of conduct, that they will look after their staff and their employees and not simply use their position to simply advance their profits. And they've done this, not if GSK don't mind me saying so, I suspect they're doing this not through any altruistic reason, but because there have been scandals in the pharmaceutical business before. So what they're saying is, no, we're going to make sure that we are doing this, and we're going to be seen to be doing this, which is very laudable. So they've said what their values are, they've said what their expectations are for all of their employees. And you're starting to see the same themes appear. Transparency, respect, integrity, accountability. And they've even very kindly given their staff a roadmap of what to do when they have things that they have to decide on. When you have a choice, does it align with our values? Is it compliant? Is it consistent with what we have set up for our organization? Have the risks been assessed? Will people understand it? So have we, or can we clearly express that? And importantly, if you're at the end of this process, would you be happy? And if the answer to any of those is no, then you might not want to do it. And unless anybody wants to put something into the chat to disagree, I would suggest that those sort of questions are a good approach for any organization. And again, it's also including all the stuff that we've been talking about. Is it consistent with our governance policies, which we have made clear and published to everyone? Are there risks? Are we compliant? Have we checked that it's within our controls? And when we're doing this, have we checked that it's not just in the current country, but in across the world, remembering that different territories have different legislation. And the example that they give there are the UK Bribery Act and the US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What they're saying is we will follow all of this legislation everywhere. So even if it doesn't apply in the particular territory, we will still follow that legislation. And they encourage people to speak up if they don't think it is happening. And to go along with that, they have an ethics and compliance program. That conforms to their industry's standard practice, the Compliance Program Guidance for Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, which is a US document. And what they're saying is, yes, we are going to follow this. Employees will comply with our code of conduct and the policies established in support of that. No equivocation, no maybe I, maybe no. You will do this. And they're saying who's in charge of that. They have a compliance officer. Most organizations of any size will have a compliance officer. Might be you at some point. Whoever's in charge of governance, risk and compliance will quite often be appointed the compliance officer. And it will be their job to oversee all of this stuff. Here, they've got multiple compliance officers because they're a big company. So they have a code of conduct for their employees. They have policies about commercial practices, policies on research and development, even policies about how much they can actually spend. If you're not aware, quite often pharmaceutical companies will directly engage with medical practitioners in the US. And it can be anything from a pen with the name of the company on it to let's have a week's conference in Hawaii where we can tell you about our new drug. California have enacted laws to do an annual spend that they can do for that, and they're saying, yes, we'll conform to that. And to make sure that people know about it, we will train them. And we will have communications that let people speak up. And we will audit all of this and monitor all this. So again, all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last wee while are all embedded in these policies. And the final one that we want to look at is the one that thankfully Caroline reminded me of. The Nolan principles for public life. Rather sadly, these had to be brought in because many people in public life had forgotten about this kind of stuff. So these came from 1995, and of course we won't, Wikipedia is not a place where we can go to reference, but it is a helpful starting point for some of the, for a basic overview. So there was a reason for this, which is that standards had fallen, standards in public life had fallen, and anyone of a certain age will remember all of the scandals that there were in Westminster in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And the idea with the Nolan Commission was to come in and say, okay, well, what should the principles be if you're involved in public life? Selflessness, so you act in terms of the public interest. So remember, this is about a public position, specifically to begin with, Westminster. So when you are in that position as an MP, you work in the public interest, not in your own interest. And many MPs have had, and some would argue still have, forgotten that. That you have integrity. You don't take decisions for financial gain for yourself or your friends. You know, it would be unthinkable under the Nolan principles, for example, to set up a VIP lane to have your friends being given public contracts for vital public health procurement. That just wouldn't be allowed. You must be objective. And again, this is the stuff that we were talking about in terms of governance. You have to actually look at the information and make a decision, which is part of the reason, of course, your assessment has that extra information on there to ensure that all of that information is available to people to make that decision. You must be open, and we were talking about having a register of interests, telling people what other things you're involved in to ensure that you're not trying to hide anything. There's a phrase somewhere that says you should ensure that there is no possibility that that it cannot look as though you're trying to hide anything. I can't remember the exact phrase, but the bottom line is If you don't know whether or not you should declare something or say that you have this other interest, then do it. And let other people decide whether or not that was appropriate or not. Holders of public office should be truthful. I'm desperately trying not to editorialize here. And there should be leadership to everyone else. And once again, I'm trying not to editorialize. So those are the 7 principles of public life founded by Nolan as part of his inquiry, as part of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Everyone who signs up to public life signs up to these principles. And again, you can decide whether or not that has been successful or not. And many other organizations have looked at these and said, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do as well. So it's expanded out to other organizations, health, education, and even private organizations. So the question in the chat is about the case study and whether a community development trust can be considered a public body in terms of thinking about, I'm assuming, in terms of thinking about these principles. So let me ask everyone that question. Rather than me answering it, let me very quickly put up a poll. Should your organization be cognizant of and follow the 7 principles of public life? And I'll make it very simple, just with a thumbs up or thumbs down. Yeah. So should your organization follow these principles? And it seems to have done it twice. So the overwhelming response is yeah. And I think what I would suggest is if you're not sure, then err on the side of caution and say, yes, okay, these are reasonable principles, let's do it. Because if you're not going to be selfless or have integrity or objectivity or accountability or openness or honesty or leadership, you have to have a really good reason to not have any of those things. No, let's not be objective. No, let's not be honest. I would struggle to think of the rationale for saying, no, we're not going to do that. So I agree with the 95% of you. And the person who doesn't think they should be, I'm more than happy to hear why I'm wrong. Either if you want to speak or if you want to put something into the chat. Okay. Any other questions? No. Okay, so this is the Okay, so Andrew's saying if it's a public body, wouldn't we consider that from the start? And there's a difference between what you have to do in terms of compliance and what you might want to do in terms of building public trust. So I'll go back to that GSK example. GSK didn't have to publish those documents, didn't have to show people what they were trying to do. And in the same way, your organization might not be a public body and it might not have to conform to some of the legislation like freedom of information or whatever it happens to be. But the question you have to ask yourself is, does your organization want to uphold those kind of standards? And does your organization want the people that they deal with to know that they uphold those kinds of standards? So the question becomes not, are they a public body or not, but what standards do you want to uphold? And you're saying it half in, half out, and that's not quite the same because they either are or are not a public body. But the question is actually more fundamental. What kind of organisation do you want to be? And you can learn from public bodies and how they approach these things. Now, it may not be enforceable. So like freedom of information, you don't have to answer freedom of information requests. And certainly for a commercial organisation, you don't want to get into that. You don't want to say what you bid for a contract because that's valuable commercial information. But on the other hand, you probably do want to say, when we're bidding for these, we will be completely open and honest and we won't have any conflicts of interest. And where you've got an organisation that deals with the public in any sort of sense, that's a sensible approach to take. So no, you're not half in and half out. You either are a public body or you're not. The question is how you approach things and what you do in order to ensure that you're seen as an organisation that takes these things seriously and can be relied upon to always conduct themselves properly. In the end, that's a choice for the organisation. But I would contend that if you're saying you do not want to take this approach, you would have to have a very good reason. So for the tutorial, and the reason I'm going over this just now is, remember what we're doing here for the cybersecurity guys. You have more time. We have more time together that the CPD people don't. But the tutorial things that are coming up aren't there for no reason. They're there because they're things that you might want to think about in terms of your approach to your final report. So what I've suggested is you look at the codes of conduct for multiple organisations, see what's the same, see what's different, and have a think about why some things are the same, and we've identified those as part of this lecture. And think about the things that aren't the same and why that might be. And then once you've done that, what that will give you is a head start on the approach that you should be using for your case study organisation. Because if you know what 10 organisations have done, the 11th isn't going to be that much different. And Andrew's making the point, would you be better off not being a public body, but conforming to some of the public body standards, like their code of conduct? And that's exactly what I'm saying. The definition of a public body is set in law, but the definition of what you do in terms of standards is set by the organisation. So even if you're not a public body in the true sense of the legislation, you may want to consider using the standards set for public life for your organisation, because they are supposed to be the gold standard. So once you've looked at them, you'll want to think about what your organization should do, and that will allow you to explain to your board why you should have a code of conduct, and you may want to suggest some of the themes that go along with that code of conduct as well. And we've looked at some of those themes today, and you might want to think about how they align with your case study. Okay, so Andrew's saying that he's saying no to he said no earlier because, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, you said no because in law they don't have to. So you weren't making a subjective call about what they should do, you're making an objective call about what they have to do. And clearly, if you have to do things, and that's why this comes under compliance, then you have to do them, full stop. But as with control, so where we've said, well, we look at compliance, but maybe we want to do better because we want our organization to be better, because we want better relations with our customers, whatever it happens to be. In the same way that we do that with compliance and control, maybe we want to do that in terms of the codes of conduct. It may not be required. It may not be in the legislation. It may not, as with bankers, be a code of conduct. It may be voluntary rather than force of law. But if you want to be taken seriously and you want to ensure that either for a new organization that's dealing with the public or has a public facing part, then maybe you want to go as far as you possibly can in terms of setting those standards. Okay, if there's no other questions, and I'm not seeing anything just now, then I will stop the recording, and as ever, this will be available on YouTube.